originating from the podcast studio inside FAM 360's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. The Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast is designed to encourage, equip, and inspire our audience through a combination of inspirational stories and real-life experiences shared by other successful and skilled leaders in a variety of vocations. We hope that the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast empowers each one of us to step out, step up, and ultimately thrive as leaders. Now here's our host, Mr. Matt Maloney.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Above and Beyond Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Mr. Matt Maloney. I am back in studio again with Miss Shaunti Feldhahn. Shaunti, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. For
those of you that didn't have an opportunity to listen to the first episode, I encourage you to go back, stream it on your favorite streaming platform, listen to it, watch it on YouTube, whatever you'd like to do. Let's go back to the book. For the benefit of the audience, would you mind sharing at a very high level, like there's 5 game-changing kind of factors.
Absolutely.
Here. Would you share what those game-changing factors are that impact married couples, in this way, and so that
sure.
as a little bit of a teaser for them, so they can be drawn into the book?
Oh, absolutely. So the most kind of day-to-day factor, which I'd love to unpack at some point if you're interested, is that we're often just not valuing what the other person is valuing. And we know that this person is a different human than we are. We are aware of that logically, and it somehow doesn't translate into the idea that therefore they will care about different things than we do when it comes to money and how we use it and all these other things. And therefore, maybe the way that they care about something is just as legitimate. Yeah. And right. And there are some people, and maybe some people who listen to this podcast, because it tends to be a higher percentage amongst those for whom they are planners, they are leaders, where they tend to think, well, of course my way is just right. And so my spouse needs to kind of get with the program. Mm-hmm. And you would never say it that way, but that's the subconscious.
That's the subconscious, yeah.
The next one is what we were talking about already, is that we have different fears that tend to get in the way, and our effort to try to relieve our fears often will make our spouses worse. And we're talking about those kind of irrational cliff fears that loom large to us, may not loom as large to our spouse. We also process decisions differently, which is something that is, again, we don't have, there's many things in the research that were, like I said, not gender related. This was another one that was actually quite gender related.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah. Again, this is going deeper than we probably have time for, but it turns out that often the way that men and women will process and make decisions, it is exactly the opposite of one another. And it has to do with the brain wiring. For example, it is more likely that if a woman is processing through a decision, you'll know about it because she'll verbalize it. And, she wants to think things through by talking them through. And so, for example, the kitchen, something just happened and she's like, we are going to redo this kitchen. Like, I am done with getting splinters from the cabinets or whatever. And so she will talk that through. How do we do it? What does it look like? What does it cost? What are some of the things that I'd be interested in? What are you thinking? And actually, that is a function of the neuroscience, that the female brain is actually wired with those connections.
Interesting.
There are exceptions, but that tends to be sort of 75 to 80% of women, according to the different kind of neuroscience studies on this. For the men, it's exactly the opposite. It's actually difficult for most men, because of the way the brain is wired, to think things through while they're talking it through. Yeah. So they go underground. And they basically want to sort of think it through internally, do the internal chess match. Mm-hmm. And that can go on for days. And meanwhile, she thinks he's ignoring me. She thinks he's not processing. She has no idea that he's doing all of this underground. Yeah. And it can pop out the other end as a decision. And he says, okay, here's what I think we should do. Now, she thinks this is the beginning of the conversation.
Right, because he hasn't even talked to her about any of this, but he's been processing it the whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, when she thinks this is the beginning of the conversation, he thinks this is the end of the story, he feels like she's criticizing him, challenging, I've been thinking about this for 3 days. Like, well, she didn't know. And so you can see how those kinds of processes of making a decision and communicating it, that can impact everything in marriage. But oh my goodness, when it comes to money, it is one of the key factors that is often running under the surface.
Big time.
So that's a third one. A fourth one is that we tend to try to resist being one in marriage in everything. And it definitely comes out in how we handle money. Because we kind of just want to do what we want to do. And we kind of have this tendency in our heart where, we know we should no longer be you and me, but we, right? Like, or that there should be a we, even if we're still you and me, like we're supposed to be one in some way. We're supposed to be joined. And yet I kind of still want to do what I want to do. And so it comes out in money a lot. Because there is a truism about, and this is something that Jesus said in the Bible, is where your money is, there your heart will be.
Yep.
And we see that constantly in the statistics, in the research that we did for this particular project, where, for example, somebody will automatically think, well, okay, you have your paycheck. I have my paycheck. You do what you want with your money. I will do what I want with my money. As opposed to, no, it's actually our money.
Yeah.
And what is it that's keeping us from like wanting to join up everything? And it gets into control, and it gets into all these other selfishnesses that get in the way of having a great marriage. Yeah,
I know. I see. It's funny you talk about that, because that's one area my wife and I don't struggle on that part of it, about hey, that's your money. That's, even from day one, we were like, okay, we're together on this part of it. Now there's a lot of other things about that we struggle on, but not that part. But it actually shocked me that so many people do live like that. Yeah. They're like, no. This is my paycheck. This is my money. I spend it. Like, we both contribute to the mortgage and to this and this, and that's how it is. But this is my money. And I'm like, what?
Oh yeah.
That's such a foreign concept to me.
Like, literally, there are times, especially now, and there's a generational thing as well.
Okay.
Like, the younger the couples were, and we were interviewing all married couples for the book and everything, because it's a little different when you're living together or whatever. Like, so we were specifically on those who were actually married. But the younger the couples were, the more likely they were to, like, in the middle of an interview with us, talking about how, like, it was very important for them to be fair. Like, it was very important. So they split all the bills down the middle as a way of kind of institutionalizing being equal, which is, like, I understand the premise behind it, the desire behind it. Like, one of them would turn to the other while we were in the middle of the interview and say, oh, by the way, can you Venmo me $58 for your half of the gas bill? And it's like,
no,
I'm not kidding. Like, this kind of stuff happened. But here's the thing, though. It's easy if you don't do that. Like, you're talking about you guys, you don't do that. It's easy to think, oh, well, that's not an issue for me. Kind of this oneness isn't a problem. And maybe it's not, right? But ask yourself, for example, okay, but do you ever pull the Amazon package off the front step before your spouse sees it?
Right.
That's the same thing. Yeah. It's our desire to try to do what we want to do.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Wow. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the topic on relationships and money, but examine it through the lens of the Bible for a moment.
Sure.
And the Bible has somewhere around 2,300 verses, something like that talk about money and possessions, and 15% of Jesus' teachings and his parables were about money and possessions. How did the Bible and its teachings on money and possessions influence your book? Did it influence your book? Did it influence, certainly it influenced you, in your calling, but did it influence the research and things in your book in that way?
Interesting question. Probably the easiest way of answering that is to say there's no way that it didn't influence it, even when I was trying to be very specific about the surveys and whatever, because it's just such a huge part of my life.
Sure.
What I always do with the surveys is we have a consultant who used to be actually chief of survey design for the Census Bureau. And he's always the one who tries to make sure, okay, these aren't leading questions or whatever. And so from a personal perspective, I try to get as kind of objective as I can when it comes to the actual research, the questions that are asked, how I analyze it, and so on.
Statistically sound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Statistically sound, significant, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to how it's applied, there are things that I'm sure are influenced by my faith in terms of how I'm analyzing it and what I'm focusing on.
Sure.
For example, what we were just talking about with kind of oneness, sort of the importance of being not just you and me, but we, right?
Yeah.
And not letting that pull you apart. So we saw in the statistics, we saw in the survey, just how many good outcomes come from into your relationship where you try to do that, and how many bad ones come when you try to not do that.
Sure.
When you try to sort of do money separately and not be one and try to kind of do what you want to do. And we saw that pretty starkly. So as a person of faith, I'm like, yes, I'm going to do a whole chapter on this. As opposed to if I wasn't, it would have been pretty tempting. And maybe that was my own personal viewpoint that that's stupid, right? Maybe it would have been pretty tempting. Well, we'll deal with that in a couple of paragraphs
right.
and,
Sure.
talk about, but there's another way of viewing it and whatever. So certainly my faith impacts how I'm analyzing some of these things and presenting them to you.
Yes, that's great. So many of our listeners obviously are going to want to take that next step to sit down with their spouse, talk with their spouse. What's one simple thing that they can do to get started? What's the starting point, the jump off point, so that they could sit down and talk with them about this?
Probably the most important jumping off point, if you're going to talk about this well, is to understand this thing we were talking about earlier of how you often value something different than your spouse is valuing. The top day-to-day cause for friction, tension, avoidance, all that kind of stuff that we just bump into on little minor things every day. So the issue with this one is you're having to learn, when you say what's the number one thing, you're having to learn what's running under the surface in terms of what your spouse actually values about how they're spending money and why. And like I said, it's very easy for us to kind of discount this person is a different human. They're going to care about something different than I do. And oh, by the way, that's legit. It's just as legitimate as what I value and what I care about, as opposed to thinking, and this is, I'm going to use Jeff's words, which always crack me up, because Jeff and I have very different money management styles. And Jeff is much more probably like you, probably like many listeners to the podcast. He's a planner. He's a saver. He's that type of personality. And I'm, like many other people, more comfortable with spending money. Not crazy, hopefully, but, that's just more comfortable. Jeff put it as, I always thought you had a character flaw. Okay.
Oh, really?
And that he wouldn't have been able to articulate that, but that's what he's thinking.
Yeah, that's right.
Underneath the surface. And so what you have to kind of ask yourself is, okay, like you go, okay, but what about if it is a character flaw? Like what if somebody has a gambling addiction? Okay. So if you have 100 objective observers, would they look at the person with the gambling addiction and say, that's a problem, that's an issue, there's something wrong there? Yeah, probably.
Sure.
Probably all 100 of them.
Yes.
Let's say they look at, and I'm making this up, Matt, but let's say they look at you and your desire is, it's just very clear to you that, we work so many hours. I've got to have some time where we get away as a family and we take a really nice 2-week vacation somewhere overseas to get away. I'm turning off my phones. And so that's what we save for every year.
Right.
Okay. And that's just, it's obvious to you. That's what we should be sort of aiming for. Maybe, again, I'm putting words in your wife's mouth, but maybe your wife says, actually, yeah, vacation is great, but what's really obvious is we really need to put our money towards having a really nice date night every 2 weeks where we can just go out, we can turn off our phones, we can reconnect,
right.
So that we're together, and knowing what's going on constantly rather than once a year. Would 100 objective observers looking at those two things say one is right and one is wrong? No, of course not.
No.
Like
they're both right.
Yeah,
just different.
They're just different. And that's what we have to kind of get inside our heads is that what your spouse values is just as legit as what you value. And yet we're not accommodating for that. We're not honoring that. And so, and I'll give you an actual example from our own life, if you don't mind, because when you ask sort of what's the number one thing for couples to do, it's learning this underground stuff and honoring it in their spouse, even if they disagree. So give you a real life example. When the pandemic hit, and, as with many people who rely on a huge percentage of our revenue came from in-person events, either directly, like an honorarium, book sales, whatever, or indirectly because people would hear about something word of mouth. They'd go buy books, they'd go buy our courses because I heard about it. When you're not out there talking, when the pandemic has shut everything down, people like me, artists, speakers, etc., our revenue just plummeted, right? Yeah. So Jeff comes to me fairly near the beginning of the pandemic, and we had been trying to sort of practice what we preached and try to talk about these things instead of avoiding them. So to his credit, he came to me.
He approached
me.
Great.
And he said, look, I have to tell you, I am struggling with a little bit of resentment. And he said, if we hadn't gone to Disney World last year with the kids on vacation, if we hadn't gone out to eat the times that you wanted to say, let's just go out to eat or go bowling with the kids to do something together. If we hadn't done those things, we would have thousands more dollars in our account right now than we could really use now that all our income has gone away. But to his credit also, then he kind of came back and he said, but I realize that's not really fair because when you were taking the kids, when you said, let's go on vacation, you were building togetherness. You were creating memories. Yeah. When we would go bowling,
speaks to your value, right?
Exactly what we were talking about. And he said all of those things were creating a sense of closeness as a family. And now we're stuck in quarantine on top of each other. And we like each other. Yeah. And he said, it's interesting how much I view spending money as purely a net outflow, net cost. You're viewing it as an investment. There's a benefit to it. And it's interesting. He said, I still I think we could have had picnics in the park for free rather than going out to dinner. And so it's not like he was necessarily agreeing with 100%. But the fact that he honored what I cared about, I'll tell you what happened. And this is, I can tell everybody listening to this who's kind of in that kind of same space with their spouse, whether it's man or woman, right? Whether depending on which way the arrow goes. But what happened with me is what happens when this kind of thing, when you honor what your spouse values, which is all my defenses dropped. And normally when my husband would approach me for a conversation, all of the tenses, yes, defenses are up, everything's tense. And instead, because it's like, oh my goodness, he doesn't necessarily agree, but he cares about what I care about, all the defenses go away. And it made it a whole lot easier to talk about and embrace what needed to happen now, which is the austerity program, right? We got to get with the program here and figure out how to do this. And I would have been able, obviously, we would have had to do that anyway. but it changed the relationship around it. And that is what we often miss, is we can get with the program technically and still be at odds and still have that resentment and still have that push and pull and that tension and avoidance and anger and frustration, as opposed to, no, we are on the same page. We may not always agree, but we have a good relationship around money.
That's such a good way to look at it. And that value factor, I mean, using that as the approachable, the tool by which to approach it, it changes everything. It changes the posture of the two individuals in the conversation. Shaunti, thanks again for joining us. I am really, really excited to have you on one more time. All of the information you've been sharing has been really relevant and credible for me and my marriage, and I hope it is for the audience as well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, looking forward to that.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to close out with this quote. It's a quote actually from your book, Thriving in Love and Money, from a section that talks about developing and recognizing generosity. And I quote, "It's a paradox, but scientists and students of scripture both know it works. If you want to thrive, be generous, not just in money, but in everything surrounding it, time, effort, care, etc. As the ancient proverb so rightly captures, the generous will prosper, those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed." To all of our listeners and subscribers out in podcast land, I hope today's episode was both empowering and inspirational. Until the next episode, I hope and pray that our daily lives are filled with opportunity to lift others up as we aim to go above and beyond. Thanks, everybody.
Our executive producer and host is Matt Maloney, President and CEO of FAM360. Strategic Communication Coordinator, Michelle Ducato. Production assistance by Tin Dog Studios. Director, John Berland. Creative Assistant, Whitney Berland. Theme song, Connecting Dots by Curtis Cole, provided by Artlist. Please subscribe today and don't miss any of our weekly episodes.